Hello everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys my weekly wrap up for November 16th through the 22nd. I had a good reading week. I didn't give anything less than 4 stars, so I definitely consider that a win. I have 5 books to discuss in today's video because I read a couple of pretty chunky books throughout the week. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get into it. I'm going to talk about the book that I liked the least and work my way to the book that I liked the most. So the first book I want to discuss is Lovely War by Julie Berry. I did give this 4 stars. I'm a little bit disappointed in this, to be quite honest, and I'm kind of sad about that because going into this I had heard so many people just rave and rave about how amazing of a historical fiction that this is, so I definitely went into it expecting a lot. I also knew that it was primarily romance centered, so I expected a really epic romance, and that's just not what I got, to be quite honest. So just to give you a basic synopsis, this centers around World War I, and this is told from the perspective of a few Greek gods and goddesses, but primarily it's from Aphrodite's point of view, who is the goddess of love. But we also get POVs from Ares, who is the god of war, Hades, who I guess you would say is the god of death, and then Apollo, who is the god of a lot of different things, but primarily in this book he is known as the god of music. So we're essentially centering around 2 romances going on during World War I and how these gods and goddesses influenced these romances. And what I did really enjoy about this book was the gods and goddesses, the immortal characters that we had. I thought that they were very interesting. They added a lot to the story. I liked getting their perspective of how the world works and how they influence the world and all of that. What I didn't love was the romance, like I said earlier. So the main romance that we have is between James and Hazel. And essentially James ends up going off to war, of course. And of course, because of the war, they end up kind of going their separate ways and finding their way back to each other throughout the book. And I just found their characters to be so bland and boring. Like, I swear neither of them had a discernible personality. And so there were quite a few points throughout this book where I was just bored because I didn't care about them. I wasn't actively rooting for these 2 people to be together because they were just so bland, you know? And then there's another romance between Colette and Aubrey. That was definitely a more interesting romance, but again, I just feel like those characters weren't dynamic enough. So like, yes, I kind of cared about them. I definitely cared about them more than James and Hazel, but at the same time, I wasn't like desperately rooting for them to be together, which is not good when you're reading a romance novel, you know? So I definitely appreciate what this novel was trying to do and the different issues that Julie Berry tackled throughout, like the racism that was going on during the time of World War I. In conjunction with talking about racism, she also talks about the Black servicemen that were in World War I, which that's something that I didn't know about. I knew about like the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, but I didn't really know much about that kind of topic in World War I. And I'll be honest, I really don't know all that much about World War I in general. So I will say I appreciated that this book taught me a few things about what was going on at that time. But like I said, the romance just didn't do it for me, so yeah, I'm settling on giving this 4 stars. Next book I want to discuss is Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerri Maniscalco. I was lucky enough to get an e-arc of this off of NetGalley, so thank you so much to NetGalley. I was really excited when I got the notification that I got approved for this one. So this is a new fantasy series by Kerri Maniscalco. She's definitely most well known for writing the Stalking Jack the Ripper series, which is more of a historical fiction / murder mystery series. So this story centers around Amelia. She is a witch living in Sicily, but Amelia has a twin sister named Vittoria. And pretty much at the very beginning of this novel, Vittoria gets brutally murdered, and so this plot becomes Amelia figuring out who killed her sister and why, and what all of that has to do with her witchcraft. She also ends up summoning a demon to try to help her find her sister's killer, but it turns out that she summons one of the princes of hell, who is named Wrath. And so now Wrath and Amelia are collaborating to try to discover who Vittoria's murderer is. So I really enjoyed this. I am giving it 4 stars. I loved the family dynamic. Like, Amelia's family is really interesting, especially her grandmother known as Nonna, because that's the Italian word for grandmother. So Amelia's family runs this very traditional Sicilian style restaurant, and so So a lot of this book is Amelia cooking, and I loved all the different descriptions of the different foods and flavors that Amelia was experimenting with. I thought that that was a lot of fun. I did overall like the direction of where the plot went, but my main gripe with this book is that it is so tropey and cliche at times. I was honestly rolling my eyes while reading this. So let's name some of the very common YA fantasy tropes. So we have a gorgeous dark-haired love interest who may or may not be evil. We have a reckless main character who constantly gets herself into trouble. We have a scene where the main character goes to this mysterious underground club that is so YA fantasy. I feel like every YA fantasy series that I've ever read has that. There is also a scene that has a snake. Again, I feel like snakes are a really popular thing in YA, and that's just to name a few. I feel like there were a couple of other tropes here and there that were definitely very cliche. Also, the murder mystery was so lame. I guessed the murderer so early on in the book. And I'm usually not great at guessing plot twists like that, but this was just so blatant to me, at least, who it was. And I don't know, at this point, I just feel like Carrie Maniscalco should just give up on writing murder mysteries, because even in her Stalking Jack the Ripper series, I always guessed who the murderer was, and in this book it was the same thing, so I'm just kind of over her murder mysteries in general. But the ending was really good to this. I'm intrigued, and I definitely am planning on checking out the sequel. So yeah, with all that being said, I did end up giving this 4 stars. All right, so next up we have Tools of Engagement by Tessa Bailey. This is the 3rd and final book in her Hot and Hammered series, and I enjoyed this one so much. I definitely was flip-flopping between like a 4 and a 4.5, but needless to say, I really enjoyed this. So this one's kind of a hate to love trope. They don't really hate each other. It's more like they're kind of annoyed by one another, but they also can't deny their attraction to one another. So we have Wes and Bethany, and essentially they are trying to flip a house, and they end up being on this very HGTV style reality show about flipping the house. And because of this kind of turns into a close proximity romance, and it was just so much fun. As always, Tessa Bailey is like the queen of writing amazing smut. It was so good. I don't think this is my favorite of the trilogy. I still think Love Her or Lose Her is my personal favorite, but this was a very solid conclusion, and I really enjoyed Wes and Bethany together, so I don't really have much more to say except that I highly recommend all 3 books in this series. Next up, we have Succubus on Top by Rochelle Mead. So this is book 2 in her Succubus Blues, or the Georgina Kincaid series. This is an adult paranormal romance series that centers around Georgina Kincaid, who is a succubus, and a succubus is essentially a female demon that feeds off of the life force of mortal men. And I had to give this 5 stars. I enjoyed this pretty much just as much as the first book. I do think that maybe that first book was slightly stronger in terms of plot and plot twists and things like that, but this was a very close second, in my opinion, a very solid sequel. I just love the forbidden romance between Georgina and Seth, who is a mortal. He actually is an author who writes Georgina's favorite series of all time, and Seth is just such a sweet guy. I love his character so much. Their dynamic is fantastic, and once again, I love all the different side characters. I loved that in this story we got introduced to Bastian, who is one of Georgina's best friends, and he's actually an incubus, which is the male version of a succubus, so that was a really cool addition to the story. So yes, I cannot wait to continue on with the series. I think that it is just fantastic. And last but certainly not least, we have to discuss The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. Man, this book was so fantastic. I'm like tearing up just thinking about how phenomenal this book is. Of course, I couldn't give it less than 5 stars. For those of you guys that may not know, this is a very popular historical fiction that is centered around World War II. We are centering around these 2 sisters, Isabelle and Vianne. They live in France, and this essentially chronicles the entire war. And we also have one of the sisters' POVs in present day in 1995, which was the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And what's so fascinating and compelling about the story is that we're centering around 2 sisters who have like polar opposite personalities, and they both have completely different reactions to the war in general. Vianne is the older sister of the two. She is a wife and mother. Her husband goes off to fight in the war, of course, and the Nazis are now occupying France. And so she lives in this very small rural town, and we're seeing how much her life and her world is changing because of their occupation. And then Isabel, who, like I said, is the younger of the two, she reacts completely differently. She decides that she wants to do all that she can to try to fight the Nazis and to try to win this war. And so she ends up joining with this rebel group, and her main job becomes rescuing downed airmen whose planes have crashed in Nazi territory. And so she rescues them before the Nazis can get to them. So it was just so compelling to see how differently these two sisters reacted to the war, but they both end up becoming heroes in their own right. And I cried so many times while reading this. This is definitely not a happy time. It is definitely a hard-hitting book, as you would expect it to be. Just loved reading a book about women's role in the war that's not just women working in factories. I feel like that's the only role you hear about in terms of women in World War II, is just that, you know, all the men went off to war, especially in the United States, and so all the women had to work in factories and do industrial jobs and things like that. And in this book, we get to see the European side of women's roles in the war and how truly heroic and brave these women were. And I just wish that that was something we were taught about in school, because I think it's just incredibly, incredibly important. You know, if we didn't have these amazing women, who knows what turn the war could have taken, you know? So yes, of course I can't recommend this highly enough, but I feel like I slept on this book for so long that everybody and their mother has already read this. So if you guys have any recommendations for historical fiction novels that are just amazing as The Nightingale, definitely leave those in the comments below. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this week's wrap up. I hope you enjoyed. I would love it, as usual, if you would leave a comment down below if you want to discuss any of the books that I brought up in this video. And I would also love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!